As someone who identifies with the centre ground of politics, and that's something I may talk more about in another video. It's something I've touched on a number of times throughout the course of the history of my channel, because after all, it's in my username, so it's a focus of my whole pitch that I am a centrist. For now, let me just say that centrism is not easy to sort of pigeonhole. It's not easy to pinpoint as one thing or another. But there are misconceptions about it. It's not sitting on the fence. I think that's probably the main misconception, is that centrists just kind of can't decide and they're just sitting in the middle. That really isn't how I feel. It's more about how your overall views on things align into the sort of centre ground. But I'll touch on that in another video. For this video, I want to talk about the media, and I am using this collectively, the media. I'm going to stick to the UK just for simplicity's sake, rather than the whole spectrum of Western media. It's just too. I think there will be some parallels in American media, but I think American media is even more polarized, and it's a whole different ball game. So I'm going to stick to the UK with this. And I want to just reflect on, if we look at the overall picture, would British media be described as veering more to the right or more to the left? Because, sometimes you get critics of the UK will just say, oh, the biased Western media, biased British media. But within the UK, it could be polarizing. Let me just start by saying that I think it's a fantasy that there is no bias in the media. Like any leading journalist or editor that claims that there isn't is lying, because there really, really is, and it's very obvious that there is an editorial angle. Now, this is not necessarily ethically wrong, so long as they're upfront about it. I mean, if you have a particular publication that is known for being left wing, they're only being true to themselves, and likewise a publication or a broadcaster that is right wing, they're only being true to themselves. What they will always say is, because I think there's two things: there's bias and there's telling the truth. Now, it's possible to be biased but still tell the truth. What I mean by that is, you can report things from such an angle that it's sympathetic to one side or another and attacking one side or another, but not necessarily telling outright lies. Editors have to be very careful. We do have strict libel laws in this country, and editors do have to be careful not to get things outright factually wrong. Nevertheless, the bias can be such that it is polarizing, and I think sometimes it's not even hidden. Particularly with newer publications, I find that there is less caution. It's just, this is what we're about, and we're not shy of that. And the giveaway, I think, is clickbait titles. When you get titles that are designed to kind of, attack one side or the other, it's not about just reporting the news. It's not just about discussing a particular subject. It's always with that angle of sort of sarcasm, and hyperbole and sensationalism. It's always there. This is not the same with every outlet or every publication. Some still take a more traditional, more diplomatic approach, can I say. I'm going to be talking about a lot of well-known publications in this video, but I do think it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a case that there's this big tribal war between left and right, and they're all kind of really sensationalistly attacking the other. In many cases, in many of the outlets I'm talking about here, they're not focusing on the other side, they're just focusing on their own angle. So it's not just tribalized. I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's the only component. So without further ado, I've made a little list there, actually, just for simplicity's sake. I've just done a little division line between broadly left and broadly right. Now, I have to put the caveat, this is very, very loose. It's not set in stone. It's only my opinion. And I have no doubt that where I place some of these outlets or publications, people will disagree and say, no, that's more to the right or that's more to the left. but it's just my opinion, it's my perspective. And I've reached this opinion from the sort of coverage that I've seen, the sort of angles they've taken on stories, and so on. But it's not set in stone. This is not an exact science, and I'm sure there's room for debate on any of these. Some are a bit more clear cut than others, I think it's fair to say. But yeah, the other thing I would say just before I read out my results, so to speak, is you're going to get a little bit of tokenism on both sides. So, for example, you'll have a really right wing publication outlet that will have token left wing commentators, one or two of them, and vice versa. On the left, you'll have a couple of conservatives. It's to kind of balance things out and to give the veneer of fairness. But really, there's very, very few publications or outlets that don't have an agenda. But like I say, that's not the same as not telling the truth. It's just that they're being selective with the truth that they tell. They're being selective with what they're reporting. Okay, so without further ado, what I've actually found is it's roughly equal, 11 on each side. I've included broadcast media, that is televised media, and also print media. And I'm focusing here on primarily current affairs and politics. I'm not thinking necessarily about popular culture. So, for example, I won't be including magazines that are devoted to popular culture. This is more about current affairs, news, politics. So, on the right, and there's going to be varying levels. Some will be centre right, some will be hard right. But I would say Talk TV, Sky News, GB News, absolutely. The Times newspaper, the Daily Telegraph newspaper, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Sun, the Daily Star. It's sensationalist, but it definitely would be more to the right if it was going to be on a side. The Evening Standard and the Spectator magazine. It's 11. A mixture of broadcast and print. Now on the left, first one is the most famous, the BBC. I have put the BBC on the left. I'll be coming back in a minute and explaining some of these. Channel 4, they're on the broadcast side of things. Novara Media on the broadcast side of things. Politics Joe on the broadcast side of things. The Daily Mirror, Guardian, the Morning Star, although it has a very small circulation. The Independent / the Eye. In fact, the Independent's only online now. It's no longer print format, but the Eye is, but they're sister papers. The National, that is a Scottish, pro-Scottish independence outlet. New Statesman and the New European on the left. Again, 11. So one can conclude based on that it's roughly 50-50. Of course, it's not that black and white. With some of these, you're going to have nuances. You're going to have, for example, I said BBC on the left. Now, there will be unquestionably people on the solid left, particularly Corbyn supporters, will say, oh, the BBC is a right-wing institution. There's lots of Tories in senior positions, people with connections to the Tory party, and they may well be right. But I think it is fair to say the overall perception of the BBC is that it is definitely more to the left. They're focused on identity politics, their political correctness over the years. There's just things that could be associated more with the left with the BBC. But like I say, this would be an example. The BBC is a huge organisation. It's 100 years old. It's the world's biggest broadcaster in terms of staff. And it's the British Broadcasting Corporation. It is our state broadcaster. But I do think overall, if you were to say, is the BBC left or right? Overall, I'd say centre-left. And likewise, Sky News is a lot more moderate, for example, than GB News. In recent years, I would say Sky is pretty centre ground. GB News is obviously well to the right. It was largely set up as a response to counter the divisiveness of woke politics and so on. I think a little bit too much. I think it is becoming a bit like the Fox News of British TV. But even GB News has some left-wing commentators. I mean, they will bring adversaries on. They have Benjamin Butterworth, who is a self-described biggest woke man in Britain, but don't assume my pronouns. So, with any of these, you're going to get tokenism pitching to the other side. Now, with the newspapers, I think it's sort of like the rivalry. I mean, for example, the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mirror aren't going to really bother one another because one's a broadsheet and one's a tabloid. Rather, the rivalry will be between the Daily Mirror and the Sun. They're both pretty wide selling, the Sun a bit more, but they're both tabloids, and so we have one on the left and one on the right. One will be attacking Labour, one will be attacking the Tories, and so they're rivals. The Telegraph's rivals probably the Guardian. The Times, I think, is a bit more centre ground, but overall slightly more on the right of things. Um, the history of newspapers is interesting because the Daily Telegraph started off in the 1850s as a Whig paper, Liberal paper. It's only really in the 20th century it became associated with the right, and it is pretty right wing now, let's face it. Um, the Daily Express, I think I'm right in saying in the 1930s it was our biggest selling newspaper. Now it's pretty secondary to the Sun and the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is often said is a paper that politicians fear because it is absolutely a tabloid. There's a lot of celebrity stories there, but it's a tabloid that takes itself more seriously than the Sun. There is sensationalism within the Daily Mail, but there's also a sort of punditry that you wouldn't necessarily see in the same way in the Sun or the Express. So I think there is probably some truth in the Daily Mail is the publication that politicians fear. Um, and then, others. I mentioned, for example, the National and the New European. Now, their focus won't be specifically left wing politics. In the case of the National, it's about Scottish independence. In the case of the New European, it's Euro integration and, anti-Brexit. In fact, it was specifically set up for that. Nevertheless, as politics is it's going to be on the side of what they perceive to be progressive politics. You'll find areas where there is differences on both sides. I mean, within, for example, on economic policy, I give an example. The Morning Star is a hard left, I would say far left publication. They're going to take a very different editorial line from, say, the Daily Mirror on, say, Hamas, what Hamas is. The Daily Mirror will have no problem calling them terrorists, whereas Morning Star would pitch a different angle with that. Or, for example, the military campaign against Assad in Syria. So, a lot of these veer more towards the centre right or the centre left. So I'm just going to conclude with some thoughts here. If like me, you're a political person, you probably find yourself getting irritated by the output of our media. If you are very much on the right of things, you're very conservative minded, you'll probably be irritated with the angle that the left take on things. And if you're very left leaning, you'll be irritated with the angle the right take on things. Now, for me, both sides annoy me, quite honestly. For example, when I see right wing publications attacking welfare claimants, using the same strategy that the Tory party uses, it angers me. I think it's often misconceptions, and it's basically stigmatizing people. It angers me, stigmatizing people who are already struggling in difficult circumstances. But then, left wing outlets will annoy me with their woke proselytizing and the narratives that they take on that issue. Um, and I was trying not to avoid too many set examples, but here's one. Novara Media had in big bold headlines, Piers Morgan has finally woke up with big bold letters to the fact Israel has gone too far. Now, what they're clearly doing there is throwing it back at Piers Morgan because he's being anti-woke. But that's an example of kind of petty partisanism. Um, I don't get a very good vibe from Novara Media. Then again, I have to be honest here. I'm an aspiring freelance journalist. I cannot be really fiercely critical of any publication because I may find myself getting no work, quite frankly. Now, I don't talk about this much because I haven't really started my career. I'm not really in a position to give examples from working experience. But what I would not do is sell my soul. I would not write something I fundamentally didn't believe in. I obviously wouldn't make up quotes on like Boris Johnson. Um, But if you're a freelancer, I've trained to be a freelance journalist. You have to be somewhat flexible minded. Now, I'd be prepared to work for the right or the left. Any editors out there, I'm open minded. I will take your pitch. I will take your angle. But the key thing is, do I have some sympathy with what I'm writing? Do I believe in this? Because I think for a journalist, if they don't believe in what they're writing, it's one big misconception about journalism is that journalists have to be absolutely neutral. Now, that's not necessarily true. Journalists are human beings. They have feelings on things. They see things. They will look at the information available. A good journalist should, of course, always tell the truth. That's golden. That's probably the single most important thing. But I think it's unreasonable to expect journalists and publications to be absolutely smack bang in the middle. And I actually think it's good for a democracy that we have a great diversity of opinions, even if they're annoying, even if sometimes the editorial line will really wind me up. I'll be thinking that that's a divisive line that they're taking, that's a stigmatizing line, or that's just distortion of what's happening. But imagine if you had a situation where there was just everything was the same propaganda as you would have in a single party state. It would be so obvious, and it would be very, so it's like democracy more general. Having that polarization, in a sense, is probably an asset to democracy more than a disadvantage. Now, I'm not saying it's all good. There's times the media can behave disgracefully, and the bias is such that it's just no longer about relaying information or generating debate. It's just mudslinging and not much else. But I think that it is healthy in a democracy to have a great plurality. And I think in the UK, we roughly have that. Now, it's not perfect. There will be times, like I say, the media behave disgracefully. There'll be outlets that are clearly pushing an agenda, and that it can polarize people and it can aggravate people. But it is important to remember we have strict libel laws in this country, and whilst publications can be very biased, and you can argue that's unfair in terms of not showing the whole picture, they do have to be careful about telling outright lies. Even sensationalist tabloids. And now, by the way, I haven't even included the likes of the Daily Sport because I don't see it as a newspaper. It barely, even the Daily Star is a notch above the Daily Sport. I mean, I don't even include that. And Morning Star is has very low circulation, but the other ones have named are pretty influential. The print press has declined in this country. The overall number of circulating. It's just a change in the industry. So, for example, in the mid-80s, the Sun was selling probably, don't quote me on this, but I think it would have been 5-6 million copies a day. That's now down to perhaps 2.5 million, and that's declining year on year. It's not necessarily that newspapers in general are losing popularity. It's more just people don't buy newspapers. They're getting expensive. People go online, and just the public habits have changed. If you look 100 years ago, to the 1920s, it would have been a common sight in London or any other big city to see people, particularly working men, businessmen, just reading the newspaper on the street. It's not totally gone, but it is more rare now. People, of course, get the news on the phone. There's all these apps, and so the technology has changed. I do think the print press could end up becoming extinct within the next, I would roughly guess, 15 years, because people will find it's like, stamps rising in price. They just can't afford it anymore. So I think the industry as a whole needs to consider news is pivotal. People need the news, and people need to be aware of what's going on in society. They need to be part of political discourse. So how do people get access to news if it gets literally more expensive to access? The Guardian, to be fair, is one of the few publications that takes a slightly different approach in terms of their subscription. Most other papers charge an upfront subscription. I think the Guardian has a kind of, that they do it a bit differently. But anyway, I'll wrap this up. I read all newspapers, even those newspapers I don't particularly like in terms of the editorial direction, because I think it's useful to get lots of different angles. The same with magazines. I've bought the New Statesman. I've also bought the Spectator. I didn't include the Week because it's harder to judge where its angle lies. And then that's a point, actually. There are other publications I haven't named at all. I didn't mention ITV um, because honestly, I'm not quite sure where that would lie. I think probably more to the centre right, but I don't watch it enough to really know. I have been critical of ITV with the way they've handled reality TV. On the other hand, I give them their due. They done that program, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, so I give them the due for that. Channel 5 I didn't include. I simply am not familiar enough with it to give an opinion. And all the other stuff, it is just my opinion. Like I said, people could disagree and say, no, that's more to the right, that's more to the left. To conclude, I think it is good that we have a plurality. I think it's good that not everything is left, not everything is right. It's guaranteed to annoy people, right? But that's still better than having a situation where, like, for example, if you're reading in a left wing tabloid something that, is really, really woke and really irritating in that sense, well, rest assured, there'll be a counter view in one of the right wing publications. Likewise, if you're of a left wing persuasion and you're reading something or you come across something on the right that's aggravating, remember there'll be a left wing counter view. That's the beauty of democracy. There is always different points of view, and they're all out there. So I think the overall pendulum is roughly 50-50. People could disagree. I think with the print press there is more of a tilt towards the right, but I think with the broadcast media, possibly more to the left. Very possibly. Let me know your thoughts.